The arrival. Jamal Carter stood outside the lavish entrance of the Gilded Plate, a celebrated restaurant renowned for its exquisite cuisine and polished ambience. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow, illuminating the restaurant's sleek glass facade and the intricate wrought iron detailing that adorned the door. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. As a prominent food critic, Jamal had dined in countless establishments, but this visit felt different. He had come under the guise of anonymity, determined to experience the restaurant as an ordinary patron. This time, it was not just about the food. It was about evaluating an establishment that had garnered rave reviews from culinary enthusiasts and critics alike. But with this anonymity came an undercurrent of anxiety. He was acutely aware of the unspoken biases that often infiltrated high-end dining establishments, especially as a black man. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere enveloped him. The scent of rich spices and freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation. Elegant chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a golden light over meticulously arranged tables, adorned with pristine white linens and delicate centerpieces. Jamal's keen eye for detail took in everything. The artfully plated dishes that floated past him on the arms of servers, the laughter of patrons, and the gentle clinking of glasses. He couldn't help but smile at the intricate design of the space, a testament to the culinary creativity and ambition of its chef, Laura Simmons. Jamal admired her work from afar, having followed her journey through various culinary competitions and shows. Yet beneath his eagerness lay a familiar tension. He had navigated the culinary world, often facing the unspoken barriers of racial bias with every step he took. As he approached the host's stand, a tall, lean figure with slicked back hair stood behind the counter. Mark, the white clerk who exuded an air of superiority. His gaze scanned the restaurant, evaluating each guest as though he were judging their worthiness to dine there. Jamal smiled politely, ready to introduce himself and request a table. "Good evening," Jamal began, his voice steady. "I'd like a table for one, please." Mark's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. His brow furrowed slightly as he glanced past Jamal, searching for someone else, as if Jamal were an inconsequential detail in a much grander picture. "We're at capacity right now," he replied, his tone dismissive. "You might want to try down the street." Taken aback, Jamal's smile faltered. "I don't think that's accurate," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I can see several empty tables." He gestured subtly to the dining area, where indeed unoccupied tables awaited patrons. "Look," Mark replied, crossing his arms defensively. "It's just not a good time. Maybe if you come back later." His voice trailed off, dripping with an unspoken implication that left Jamal feeling small and unwelcome. Jamal's heart sank. The humiliation washed over him like a cold wave, igniting a familiar anger. "Are you refusing to serve me because of my skin color?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to keep his composure. Mark scoffed, his disdain palpable. "You can take it however you want," he shot back, the condescension in his voice unmistakable. "But this is a high-end restaurant, and we have standards." Staring at the man before him, Jamal felt the weight of centuries of prejudice bearing down on him. The restaurant's reputation for excellence suddenly felt like a hollow facade, masking the ugly truth of its culture. Defeated yet resolute, he turned on his heel and walked away, each step heavier than the last. This experience would not be forgotten. He would document this moment, not just for himself, but for the countless others who had faced similar discrimination. As he stepped back onto the bustling street, Jamal took a deep breath, trying to shake off the sting of humiliation. He couldn't help but reflect on the systemic racism that permeated the culinary world, an industry that prided itself on diversity yet often fell short of its ideals. With a determined glint in his eye, Jamal pulled out his notebook, ready to encapsulate the experience. "This isn't over," he murmured to himself, the weight of his pen feeling heavier than ever. not by a long shot. Inside the restaurant, the ambience was a stark contrast to the brewing storm just outside its doors. Chef Laura Simmons sat at a long, polished table surrounded by her management team, a group of anxious faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. The air was thick with tension as they discussed the financial struggles that had plagued the establishment since its peak. "We need to revitalize this place," Laura said, her voice steady yet laced with urgency. "The reviews have been merciless, and our last launch was a disaster. If we don't turn this around, we could lose everything we've built." She glanced around the table, seeking the support of her team. "Maybe we should consider a new marketing strategy," suggested Tom, the marketing director, fiddling with his pen as if it were a lifeline. "We could host a special event to attract more customers, celebrity chefs, live music, something to get the buzz going again." Laura nodded, appreciating the input but knowing that the underlying issues ran deeper. "That's all well and good, Tom, but we also need to ensure our service matches the expectations we're trying to set. We can't just throw money at the problem." Across the room, Mark leaned against the wall, arms crossed, silently listening to the conversations unfolding. He felt the weight of pressure on his shoulders, a dark cloud forming as he imagined the elite clientele that had once graced the restaurant's tables now shunning them. "Honestly," he chimed in, his voice dripping with disdain, "we need to keep the wrong crowd out. It's not just about the food. It's about the atmosphere. If we keep serving people who don't fit the image we're trying to project, we'll never recover." Maria, a Latina server who had been quietly clearing dishes, paused mid-task. Her heart raced as a pang of frustration bubbled within her. She had witnessed how Mark treated certain customers, how he smirked when dismissing those who didn't fit his narrow view of acceptable clientele. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Mark, that's not right," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. You can't just decide who belongs here." Mark turned to her, disbelief etched across his face. "And what would you know about it, Maria? You're a server, not management. Maybe if you understood the stakes, you'd think differently." Maria felt her cheeks flush with anger, but pressed on. "I understand a lot more than you think. We're all here to make this place work, but your attitude is pushing people away. You think the right crowd will keep us afloat, but you're just perpetuating a toxic environment." Mark scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "You're too emotional. This isn't about feelings. It's about business. And if you can't see that, maybe you shouldn't be working here. Maybe you should consider how your views affect our business," she shot back, her voice rising. The tension in the room thickened as the rest of the management team exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to intervene. Laura, sensing the building conflict, interjected. "Mark, we need everyone on the same team if we're going to fix this. Maria's right. Our environment needs to be welcoming to all. We can't afford to alienate potential customers." Mark's expression darkened further, a mix of anger and disbelief. "You really think a couple of feel-good policies will save us? This is a cutthroat industry, and if you can't acknowledge that, we're doomed." With that, he pushed away from the wall, determination etching itself into his features. But Jamal, having just witnessed the exchange from a distance, couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a larger battle against the biases that plagued the culinary world. He would not only write about his experience at the Gilded Plate, but he would also become a voice for those who felt silenced by the industry's unspoken prejudices. As he walked away from the restaurant, Jamal felt a spark ignite within him. He was determined not just to critique the food but to challenge the entire system, one story at a time. And in that moment, he understood that his role as a critic extended far beyond the plate. It was about advocacy and change in an industry that desperately needed it. The seeds of change. After leaving the Gilded Plate, Jamal found himself wandering through the nearby streets, the cacophony of the city filling his senses. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement as he reflected on the harsh encounter with Mark and the deeper implications of that moment. The disappointment and anger churned inside him, but amidst the turmoil, a sense of purpose began to take root. Jamal pulled out his notebook and began to scribble furiously. He outlined his experience, hoping to capture the emotions that surged within him. He felt a profound responsibility to represent not just his own feelings of humiliation, but also the countless other voices silenced by bias in the culinary world. He wrote about the oppressive weight of systemic racism that seemed to shadow every high-end restaurant, lurking beneath the surface of culinary excellence. He paused, pen hovering over the page, contemplating how to convey the complex web of discrimination that pervaded the industry. It wasn't just about one encounter. It was about the myriad ways individuals were judged and marginalized, not by their skills or talent, but by the color of their skin. Jamal was determined to challenge the narrative, to highlight the experiences of chefs and diners who faced the same indignities he had. As he walked, he remembered his own journey into the culinary world. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, his family's kitchen had been a sanctuary, a place where flavors mingled and creativity flourished. His grandmother, a phenomenal cook, had taught him that food was not just sustenance, but a means of storytelling, a way to connect with others. He recalled how, at a young age, he would experiment with different spices and flavors, often bringing friends over to taste his creations. Cooking had become his refuge, and he found solace in the alchemy of ingredients, transforming into something beautiful and delicious. However, as he pursued a career as a food critic, he encountered the harsh realities of the culinary industry. The bias against chefs of color was pervasive, often manifesting in subtle ways, from dismissive attitudes to outright exclusion from major culinary events. Feeling rejuvenated, Jamal made his way to a local cafe, where he settled into a corner table with a warm cup of coffee and his notebook. He began writing a blog post titled "Behind the Plate," a critique of culinary bias. The words flowed from him, capturing the essence of his experience at the Gilded Plate and weaving in stories of other chefs and critics who faced similar struggles. He emphasized the importance of representation in all culinary spaces and called for a reckoning within the industry. As he typed, a familiar figure caught his eye. It was Maria, the Latina server who had stood up to Mark earlier that evening. She entered the cafe, looking weary but resolute. Jamal had seen her in the restaurant, but he didn't know much about her story. He quickly waved her over, and she hesitated for a moment before joining him at his table. "Hey, I saw you earlier," he began, a friendly smile on his face. "I really admired how you stood up to that guy. It takes a lot of courage." Maria smiled faintly, though her expression held a mix of frustration and determination. "Thanks. It just felt like it was time to say something. I'm tired of watching people be treated poorly, especially when they're just trying to enjoy a meal." Jamal nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I get that. I just had a pretty awful experience trying to get a table at your restaurant. I'm a food critic, but I was treated like I didn't belong there. It's disheartening." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You're Jamal Carter. I've read your reviews. You're really respected in the industry." Jamal shrugged, not wanting to dwell on the praise while still feeling the sting of his recent rejection. "Thanks, but that doesn't seem to matter much when I walk into a place and am judged by my skin color instead of my profession." Maria leaned in, her voice low. "You know, it's not just Mark. There's a culture in that restaurant that makes it hard for people like us to feel welcome. I've seen how he treats patrons and staff who don't fit his narrow view of who should be in that space." "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," Jamal said, his pen tapping against the table. "The culinary world prides itself on diversity, but when it comes down to it, there are still barriers that exclude people of color. We need to change that narrative." As their conversation deepened, Jamal learned more about Maria's background. She had grown up in a family of immigrant workers, often helping her parents in the kitchen as they prepared traditional dishes from their homeland. Cooking had been a way for them to connect to their culture, and Maria had always dreamed of sharing that passion with a broader audience. However, after taking a job at the Gilded Plate, she quickly realized the environment was stifling her creativity and ambitions. "I feel like I'm constantly walking on eggshells," she confessed. "I love my job, but the pressure to conform to a certain standard, one that isn't reflective of who I am, can be exhausting." Jamal nodded, fully empathizing. "That's exactly how I feel as a critic. We're often boxed into these categories, forced to play by someone else's rules. But I think we can change that. If we work together and share our stories, we might be able to shed light on these biases." Maria's eyes sparkled with determination. "What do you have in mind?" Jamal leaned back, taking a moment to formulate his thoughts. "What if we created a platform, something that highlights the voices and experiences of chefs and culinary professionals of color? We could gather stories, write articles, and even host events to showcase diverse talent in the industry." Maria's face lit up with enthusiasm. "I love that idea. There are so many chefs who have incredible stories to tell, but they often go unheard." Jamal and Maria spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, sketching out plans for a blog and potential events that could celebrate diversity in the culinary world. They discussed how they could partner with local community centers and culinary schools, offering workshops and classes that emphasized inclusivity and creativity in cooking. The more they talked, the more they envisioned a movement, one that could push back against the entrenched biases they had both faced. As their conversation flowed, Jamal felt a renewed sense of hope. They were no longer just victims of the system. They were becoming agents of change. He was invigorated by the prospect of combining their talents to create something meaningful, a space where diverse voices could flourish and be celebrated. Eventually, they exchanged contact information and agreed to meet regularly to further develop their ideas. Jamal left the cafe with a lightness in his step, his heart filled with determination. It was the beginning of something significant, something that could disrupt the status quo and pave the way for future generations of culinary talent. Later that evening, back at his apartment, Jamal opened his laptop and began to write again. He crafted a new post titled "Voices Unheard," a call for culinary equity. He poured his heart into it, recounting his encounter with Maria and their shared vision. With every word, he felt as though he was tapping into a collective consciousness, a gathering of voices ready to stand up against the inequities that plagued the culinary landscape. As he clicked publish, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The seeds of change had been planted, and he was determined to nurture them, fostering a community that could challenge the industry's deep-seated biases. It was a journey he had not anticipated, but one he was now ready to embrace with open arms. Days turned into weeks, and Jamal and Maria worked tirelessly to develop their platform. They named it Culinary Voices, a space dedicated to showcasing diverse chefs, their stories, and their unique contributions to the culinary arts. The duo reached out to their networks, gathering testimonials from chefs and culinary professionals who had faced discrimination. They also organized a series of pop-up events that featured a lineup of chefs from various backgrounds, each showcasing their culinary heritage. Each event became a celebration of diversity, and the attendance exceeded their expectations. Food lovers from all walks of life came to experience the rich tapestry of flavors and stories. As word spread about their efforts, local media began to take notice. Articles and blog posts highlighted their initiative, prompting discussions about the need for greater inclusivity within the culinary scene. Jamal felt a rush of excitement as he saw the ripple effects of their work beginning to take hold. However, the path was not without its challenges. Mark, having heard of Culinary Voices, took umbrage with the growing attention it was garnering. He viewed it as a direct challenge to the status quo he had upheld at the Gilded Plate. In his eyes, they were undermining the restaurant's carefully curated image. One afternoon, while scrolling through social media, Jamal came across a particularly scathing post from Mark. It derided their efforts, dismissing Culinary Voices as an attempt to politicize the dining experience. Mark argued that diners should be free to enjoy their meals without the distraction of social issues. Jamal's heart sank as he read the comments that followed, some supportive, but many echoing Mark's sentiments, promoting a narrative that dismissed the very real experiences of countless individuals. The negativity was disheartening, but he knew this was part of the battle. "Don't let it get to you," Maria said during their weekly meeting, her tone resolute. "This is just a sign that we're making waves. If Mark didn't care, he wouldn't waste his time trying to silence us." "You're right," Jamal replied, taking a deep breath. "But it's frustrating to see people so unwilling to acknowledge the issues we're trying to address." Maria placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Change doesn't happen overnight. We're planting seeds, and sometimes it takes time for them to grow. We just have to keep nurturing them." Emboldened by her words, Jamal channeled his energy into Culinary Voices. They organized an upcoming event titled Taste of Diversity, featuring a panel discussion where chefs would share their experiences in the culinary world. They reached out to local influencers and food bloggers, hoping to draw a crowd that would help amplify their message. As the event approached, Jamal felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This would be their chance to showcase the power of diverse culinary voices and challenge the entrenched biases that had long governed the industry. He and Maria were determined to create a space where stories could be shared openly, fostering empathy and understanding among all who attended. On the night of the event, the venue buzzed with energy. Colorful banners adorned the walls, celebrating the culinary traditions represented on stage. The aroma of spices and flavors wafted through the air, drawing attendees toward a beautiful spread of food prepared by the chefs participating in the panel. Jamal took a deep breath, soaking in the vibrant atmosphere. As he looked around, he saw people from all backgrounds coming together to celebrate diversity in food. The feeling of community enveloped him, a reminder of why they had started this journey in the first place. The panel discussion began, featuring chefs who shared their personal stories, tales of struggle, resilience, and triumph in the face of bias. Each chef's experience resonated deeply with the audience, creating an emotional connection that transcended the boundaries of race, culture, and background. Jamal moderated the panel, carefully guiding the discussion to ensure every voice was heard. As the chefs spoke about their challenges, Jamal felt a surge of pride. This was the conversation he had longed for, a candid dialogue that dismantled stereotypes and opened the door for change. By the end of the evening, Jamal and Maria received an outpouring of support from attendees. Many expressed gratitude for creating a space where they felt seen and valued. The success of Taste of Diversity fueled their determination to continue their mission, pushing forward despite the challenges that lay ahead. As Jamal packed up at the end of the night, he realized that this was only the beginning. The seeds of change had indeed taken root, and with every event, they were fostering a community ready to challenge the culinary landscape together. With Maria by his side and the support of many others, Jamal felt a sense of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the industry was beginning to shift toward a more inclusive future. A fire ignites. Weeks had passed since the successful launch of Taste of Diversity, but the fire sparked that night only grew stronger. Jamal and Maria's movement, Culinary Voices, was steadily gaining momentum, drawing attention from food lovers, chefs, and even journalists. Their platform became a space where chefs of color shared their stories, offering readers a glimpse into their unique cultural backgrounds, struggles, and triumphs in the culinary world. However, with the growing success of their platform came an unexpected wave of opposition. The backlash from traditionalist voices in the industry was louder than ever. Critics like Mark attempted to discredit their work, labeling it as politicizing food and accusing them of playing the race card to gain attention. But Jamal knew this pushback was inevitable. It was a reflection of the very barriers they were working to break. One afternoon, Jamal sat at his cluttered kitchen table, sifting through emails and comments that had flooded their website. While many messages were supportive, offering gratitude and praise for the initiative, A few stood out with their biting negativity. "Stick to food and stop playing social justice warrior," read one comment. "No one wants to hear about your sob stories while eating dinner," another email scoffed. Jamal sighed, feeling the weight of these words pressing down on him. He had expected resistance, but the intensity of the criticism was unsettling. Every day, it seemed, someone new was attacking their work, insisting that food was meant to be a neutral space, free of the burdens of race and identity. He shared these concerns with Maria during one of their meetings at a cozy cafe downtown. Sitting across from him, Maria sipped her coffee thoughtfully, her brow furrowed in contemplation. "I've been thinking about it too," Maria said, setting her cup down. "I know what we're doing is important, but it's tough to see so much negativity. It feels like people don't want to acknowledge the truth." Jamal nodded, his eyes heavy with concern. "It's frustrating. We're not just talking about food. We're talking about people's lived experiences. How can anyone ignore that?" Maria leaned forward, her eyes bright with determination. "They can't ignore it forever. People resist change because it threatens the comfort of their world. But I think we're starting to break through. Look at how much support we've gained. Chefs are reaching out from across the country. People who've never had a voice before are now sharing their stories with us." Jamal smiled at her optimism. She was right, of course. Despite the backlash, culinary voices had tapped into something powerful. The culinary world had long been dominated by a narrow perspective, but now, a diverse range of voices were beginning to emerge from the shadows. A few days later, Jamal received an unexpected phone call from an editor at a prominent food magazine. They had noticed the buzz surrounding culinary voices and wanted to feature both Jamal and Maria in an upcoming issue about the future of food. The editor praised their initiative, describing it as a much-needed breath of fresh air in an industry that was, at times, stagnant and out of touch with the real world. Jamal could hardly believe it. Being featured in such a prestigious publication would give them a platform to reach an even larger audience. When he shared the news with Maria, she was equally ecstatic. "We're making waves, Jamal," Maria said, her voice filled with excitement. "This is our chance to show the world that food is more than just what's on the plate. It's culture, history, and identity. We're proving that diversity isn't just a trend, it's the future." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of interviews, photo shoots, and brainstorming sessions for the magazine feature. Jamal and Maria worked tirelessly, crafting their narrative and ensuring that the focus remained on the chefs they were representing. The magazine piece highlighted several chefs who had contributed to Culinary Voices, each sharing their unique journey through the culinary world. Some had overcome poverty and systemic racism to open their own restaurants, while others had fought against the cultural appropriation of their traditional dishes in high-end restaurants. The feature was a hit. The magazine flew off the shelves, and the article sparked widespread conversation. Chefs from all over the country began to reach out, wanting to be part of the movement. They wanted their stories heard, and they wanted to be part of a community that celebrated diversity rather than stifling it. Yet even as Culinary Voices gained more recognition, there was a growing tension simmering beneath the surface. Jamal had been receiving anonymous emails for weeks, many of them laced with thinly veiled threats. Some warned him to stop stirring the pot, while others accused him of trying to tear down the fine dining world. One particularly disturbing message simply read, "You're ruining the restaurant industry." Jamal tried to shrug off the threats, but they lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a new email notification. The subject line read, "Urgent. Let's talk." He hesitated before opening it, expecting another piece of hate mail. But instead, it was from someone he never expected to hear from. Laura Simmons, the renowned executive chef of the Gilded Plate, the very restaurant where Jamal had faced discrimination, had reached out to him directly. Jamal. I've been following the work you've been doing with Culinary Voices, and I wanted to reach out. I've been reflecting on a lot of things since that night you came to my restaurant. I'd like to meet and have an open conversation if you're willing. I think it's time we both address some things that have been left unsaid. Laura ***. Jamal stared at the screen, his mind racing. This was the woman at the helm of the restaurant where he had been dismissed so callously. What could she possibly want to discuss? Part of him wanted to ignore the message altogether. He had nothing to prove to her, but another part of him was curious. What could have caused her to reach out now? After several moments of contemplation, Jamal decided to reply. I'm open to a conversation. Let me know when and where. A few days later, Jamal found himself standing outside the Gilded Plate once again. This time, it was under very different circumstances. He had agreed to meet Laura at the restaurant after hours, where they could talk privately. His stomach churned with a mix of curiosity and apprehension as he pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The restaurant was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling ambience he had encountered on his previous visit. Laura Simmons sat at a table near the back, her posture tense but composed. She looked up as Jamal approached, offering a tentative smile. "Jamal," she said, rising to greet him. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." He nodded, taking a seat across from her. "I'll admit, I was surprised to hear from you." Laura sighed, her gaze dropping to the table. "I understand. I've been doing a lot of soul-searching since that night. What happened? How you were treated? It wasn't right. I've known Mark for years, and I trusted him to represent this restaurant with integrity. But that trust was misplaced." Jamal listened, unsure of where this conversation was heading. He had come prepared to defend his actions, to explain why Culinary Voices was necessary, but now he found himself listening to a woman who seemed genuinely remorseful. "I built this restaurant with a vision of excellence," Laura continued, her voice softening. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what that truly means. I let people like Mark dictate who belongs in a space that was supposed to celebrate great food, regardless of who's eating it. I've read your blog, Jamal. I've seen the stories you've shared, and I realize now that I've been part of the problem." Jamal's skepticism lingered, but he could sense the sincerity in her words. He decided to push further. "Why now? What made you decide to reach out?" Laura exhaled, as if releasing a burden she had been carrying. "Because I saw what you're building with Culinary Voices, and it made me reflect on my own career. I've always prided myself on being innovative in the kitchen, but I've been stagnant in other ways. I've excluded voices that should have been part of this world. I want to change that." Jamal felt a flicker of hope. Could this be genuine? Was Laura Simmons, one of the most respected chefs in the industry, actually admitting fault? "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Laura continued. "I'm asking for a chance to make things right. I want to be part of the solution, and I want the Gilded Plate to become a place that embraces diversity, not shuns it. But I can't do that without confronting the biases that have been allowed to fester here." Jamal studied her for a moment, weighing her words. He had come to this meeting with guarded expectations, but Laura's humility was disarming. Could she truly be committed to change? And if so, was he willing to give her that chance? "I didn't expect this conversation," Jamal admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But if you're serious about making changes, then I'm willing to listen. However, it's going to take more than words. Actions matter, Laura." She nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I'm ready to act. But I need your help, Jamal. I need the voices of people like you, people who have been silenced for too long. Let's work together to transform this place into something we can both be proud of." Jamal sat in silence for a few moments, considering her offer. Could he really work with the very restaurant that had once humiliated him? Could this be the opportunity to enact real change from within the industry? Finally, he extended his hand. "All right, Laura, let's see what we can do." And with that, a new chapter began. Seeds of change. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change at the Gilded Plate. Laura Simmons wasn't just talking about transforming her restaurant. She was taking bold steps to make it happen. And Jamal, skeptical at first, found himself surprisingly invested in the process. Their collaboration began with a series of private meetings between Jamal, Maria, and Laura's management team. These weren't the typical strategy sessions about marketing or menu design. Instead, they focused on dismantling the ingrained biases that had allowed someone like Mark to flourish unchecked. Jamal knew it would take time to shift a culture that had been so long entrenched in exclusionary practices, but Laura's willingness to confront the issue head-on gave him cautious optimism. The first step was simple but powerful: accountability. Laura took ownership of the fact that the discrimination Jamal had faced wasn't an isolated incident. Under her direction, the Gilded Plate began implementing diversity training for the entire staff, focusing on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and the importance of representation in the workplace. Jamal and Maria were both invited to facilitate these sessions, offering insights from their experiences and those of the chefs who had shared their stories through culinary voices. The staff training was eye-opening for many, but not everyone embraced it immediately. Mark, in particular, was resistant. He had managed to avoid direct confrontation since his conversation with Maria, but it was clear he felt threatened by the changes happening around him. Laura, however, made it clear that there would be no room for intolerance in her restaurant moving forward. Mark's influence was waning, and Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched the dynamics begin to shift. One evening, after an exhausting but productive day of training, Jamal and Maria lingered in the dining room, discussing the progress they had made so far. The restaurant was quiet, the last of the staff having left for the night. The warm glow of the chandeliers cast long shadows across the tables, lending an air of intimacy to their conversation. "I never thought I'd be working with the people who once dismissed me," Jamal mused, sipping from his cup of coffee. "It's surreal." Maria smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft light. "It's strange, isn't it? But it feels like the right kind of strange. Like we're really making a difference." Jamal nodded thoughtfully. "Laura's been genuine so far. I didn't expect that from someone so embedded in the high-end culinary world. But she's putting in the work. I think she sees this as her redemption," Maria replied, leaning back in her chair. "She built a successful restaurant, but now she's realizing that success isn't just about Michelin stars and rave reviews. It's about the people who make the restaurant what it is. It's about integrity." As they spoke, Jamal found himself reflecting on the changes they had already initiated. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope for an industry that had often felt indifferent to people like him. Change was happening, albeit slowly, but it was happening nonetheless. In the following weeks, Laura took another bold step that surprised everyone. She decided to overhaul the menu at the Gilded Plate. In a meeting with the restaurant's kitchen staff and management team, she explained her vision for a more inclusive and culturally diverse menu. "We've been known for our European-inspired cuisine," Laura said, addressing her staff. "And while that's part of our identity, it's not the only story we can tell. I want to expand our menu to include dishes from around the world, but more importantly, I want those dishes to be created and prepared by chefs who come from those cultures. We've been missing out on a huge opportunity to celebrate the diversity of food, and that changes today." There was a palpable excitement in the room as Laura unveiled her plan. She wanted to bring in guest chefs from a variety of backgrounds, each representing a different culinary tradition. These chefs wouldn't just be brought in as token representations of their cultures, but as creative partners with the freedom to showcase their own authentic recipes and flavors. Jamal and Maria were ecstatic. This was exactly the kind of initiative they had been advocating for through Culinary Voices, a platform that celebrated food as a reflection of identity and culture, not as a sterile, depersonalized commodity. They helped Laura reach out to several chefs who had shared their stories on the platform, inviting them to take part in this ambitious new project. One of the first chefs to accept the invitation was Chef Amina Mahdi, a rising star in the culinary world known for her vibrant West African dishes. Her restaurant in Harlem had been gaining attention for its bold flavors and her unapologetic embrace of her heritage. When Amina arrived at the Gilded Plate, she was greeted with open arms, and Laura made it clear that she would have full creative control over the dishes she wanted to feature on the menu. Jamal watched with pride as Amina took her place in the kitchen, her presence a symbol of the change they were fighting for. The other chefs and kitchen staff, initially hesitant about the introduction of new flavors and techniques, quickly found themselves inspired by Amina's passion and expertise. Her dishes, spicy jollof rice, soya-spiced meats, and puff desserts, were a hit, drawing in a new crowd of diners who were eager to experience something different. The revamped menu didn't just stop at African cuisine. In the coming months, the Gilded Plate hosted guest chefs specializing in everything from traditional Mexican mole to the delicate spices of Indian biryani. Each chef brought something unique to the table, and the restaurant's reputation began to shift. No longer seen as a stuffy, Eurocentric establishment, it was now becoming a destination for food lovers who craved innovation and diversity. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Mark, who had grown increasingly isolated within the restaurant, finally reached his breaking point. He had been vocal in his opposition to the new direction, insisting that the Gilded Plate was losing its identity. He openly criticized the guest chefs, claiming that their dishes were too exotic for the restaurant's clientele and that the focus on diversity was alienating their loyal customers. It all came to a head one evening during a busy service, when Mark confronted Laura in the middle of the kitchen. Jamal happened to be there, working on a story about Amina's culinary journey, when he overheard the heated argument. "This is ridiculous, Laura," Mark shouted, slamming a hand down on the counter. "You're turning this place into a circus. These so-called chefs are ruining what we've built. Our customers don't want spicy street food. They want elegance and refinement." Laura remained calm, her arms crossed over her chest. "Our customers are evolving, Mark. And so are we. This is the future of the Gilded Plate. If you can't get behind that, then maybe this isn't the right place for you anymore." Jamal watched as Mark's face twisted with rage. "So that's it? You're just going to throw everything away? For what? To prove a point?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Laura said, her voice steady. "I'm building something better, something that actually represents the world we live in. And if you can't see the value in that, then yes, Mark, it's time for you to move on." There was a tense silence in the kitchen as Mark stood there, fuming. Finally, he turned on his heel and stormed out, leaving the restaurant and his job behind. As the door swung shut behind him, Laura let out a breath she had been holding. She turned to the kitchen staff, who had all stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. "We're not going backward," she said firmly. "We're only moving forward from here." Jamal couldn't help but admire her resolve. This was the kind of leadership the industry needed, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right, even if it meant losing people along the way. That night, as he and Maria sat down to one of Amina's dishes in the dining room, Jamal reflected on how far they had come. The Gilded Plate was transforming before his eyes, not just in terms of its menu, but in its very soul. What had once been a symbol of exclusion and elitism was now becoming a beacon of inclusivity and innovation. "We did this," Maria said, breaking into his thoughts. "You, me, Laura, Amina, and everyone else who believed in what we were trying to do. We're changing the industry, one restaurant at a time." Jamal smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yeah," he agreed, taking a bite of the delicious jollof rice. "We are." The resistance to change, the excitement surrounding the transformation of the Gilded Plate continued to build, both inside and outside the restaurant. With each new guest chef and each carefully crafted dish that celebrated cultural diversity, it felt like something revolutionary was unfolding. Jamal, Maria, and Laura had formed an unlikely but effective team, each contributing to the restaurant's evolution in their own way. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Beneath the surface, A quiet resistance was brewing, one that threatened to undo all their hard work. A new kind of attention. As word spread about the Gilded Plate's bold new direction, it began attracting the attention of not just food enthusiasts, but also the culinary elite. Food bloggers, critics, and even celebrities flocked to the restaurant to experience the diversity of flavors and to witness the innovative changes happening in its kitchen. The once empty tables were now filled, and for the first time in years, the restaurant was seeing a steady increase in revenue. However, with the newfound success came the inevitable backlash. One evening, as Jamal was reviewing the latest reviews and articles written about the Gilded Plate's transformation, he came across a particularly scathing review in an influential food magazine. The author, a well-known critic named Vincent Gregory, lambasted the restaurant for what he described as abandoning its roots and pandering to the politically correct masses. Jamal read the review aloud to Maria and Laura as they sat in Laura's office, their faces growing more and more incredulous with each sentence. "They've replaced elegance with gimmickry," Vincent had written. "The Gilded Plate, once a bastion of fine European cuisine, has devolved into a hodgepodge of exotic street foods that lack the sophistication and refinement its patrons have come to expect. What was once a jewel in the city's culinary crown has now become a sideshow for those obsessed with the latest trend of so-called diversity." The reviews stung, and Jamal felt the anger rising in his chest. It wasn't just the dismissive tone of the critique. It was the underlying implication that food from non-European cultures was somehow less valuable, less refined. This was the exact attitude they had been fighting against, and now it was being reinforced by one of the most respected voices in the culinary world. Maria, sitting across from Jamal, shook her head in disbelief. How can someone still think like this? It's 2024, and we're still dealing with this kind of ignorance. Laura leaned back in her chair, a troubled expression on her face. "I knew we'd face resistance, but I didn't expect it to come from someone as influential as Vincent Gregory. His reviews can make or break a restaurant." Jamal sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is exactly why we need to keep pushing forward. If we let one critic define us, then we've already lost. The problem is deeper than one bad review. It's the entire system of gatekeeping in the culinary world that upholds Eurocentrism as the gold standard." Laura nodded, but Jamal could see the worry in her eyes. Despite their progress, the restaurant was still walking a fine line. The old guard, the wealthy, predominantly white clientele who had frequented the Gilded Plate for years, were starting to feel alienated by the changes. And while the new crowd of diners appreciated the fresh direction, there was no guarantee that it would be enough to sustain the restaurant long term. "We can't afford to lose our core customers," Laura said softly. "But at the same time, we can't go backward." Maria glanced at her. "What are you saying? You're not thinking of changing course, are you?" Laura shook her head. "No, not at all. I'm fully committed to this new vision. But I need to be realistic about the challenges we're facing. If too many people like Vincent Gregory turn against us, we could lose the momentum we've built." Jamal leaned forward, his voice firm. "Then we need to make sure people understand what we're doing here. We need to get out ahead of this narrative and show that diversity doesn't mean sacrificing quality. If anything, it enhances it." The tension in the room was thick. Laura had invested everything she had into turning the restaurant around, but now they were facing a battle on multiple fronts, winning over the critics, keeping the old clientele satisfied, and maintaining the authenticity of the changes they had worked so hard to implement. But Jamal knew they couldn't back down now. This was bigger than just one restaurant. This was about challenging the status quo of an entire industry. The internal struggle. As the weeks went on, Jamal noticed subtle shifts in the behavior of some of the staff members. Though many had embraced the changes enthusiastically, there were a few who seemed uncomfortable with the new direction. Some of the longtime waiters and kitchen staff, those who had been loyal to Mark and the restaurant's old ways, began to show signs of resentment. At first, it was small things. A server would accidentally mispronounce the name of a dish from one of the guest chefs or fail to give certain dishes the same attention and care they showed the European ones. Jamal overheard whispers of discontent in the staff rooms. Comments about how the restaurant was losing its identity, about how traditional customers were being ignored in favor of the new, more diverse crowd. The breaking point came one evening when a customer sent back a dish prepared by Chef Nguyen, a Vietnamese chef who had recently joined as part of the guest chef initiative. The customer claimed the dish was too foreign and not what they expected from the gilded plate. The server, instead of defending the dish, agreed with the customer and went so far as to say, "I know, we've been doing a lot of that lately. I miss the old menu too." Jamal happened to be nearby and overheard the entire exchange. His stomach twisted with frustration. He knew that changing the culture of a restaurant was more than just updating the menu or hiring new chefs. It was about getting everyone on board with the new vision. And clearly, there were still some who hadn't bought in. Later that evening, he brought the issue to Laura's attention. They were sitting in the restaurant's office, the sounds of the kitchen staff cleaning up after service faintly audible in the background. "We can't keep ignoring this," Jamal said, his voice tight with frustration. "Some of your staff are actively undermining the changes we're trying to make. It's not just about one bad review or a few disgruntled customers. It's about the people working here too." Laura sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know. I've noticed it too. But what can I do? I can't force people to change their minds." "You don't have to force them," Jamal replied. "But you do need to make it clear that this new direction isn't optional. If they can't get on board, then maybe this isn't the right place for them anymore." It was a hard truth, but one that needed to be said. Jamal understood that the restaurant staff had been through a lot of changes in a short amount of time, and not everyone was going to adapt easily. But for the restaurant to truly succeed in its new mission, everyone needed to be on the same page. Laura was silent for a few moments, her eyes fixed on the floor. Finally, she looked up at Jamal, her expression resolute. "You're right," she said softly. "I've been trying to avoid confrontation, but I can't let this slide any longer. If people aren't willing to support what we're building here, then they need to go." Jamal nodded. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. They couldn't afford to let internal resistance derail everything they had worked for. Confrontation. The next day, Laura called a staff meeting. Everyone was there. Servers, kitchen staff, managers, even the dishwashers. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and Jamal could feel the unease radiating from certain corners. Laura stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped in front of her. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I want to start by saying how proud I am of the progress we've made over the past few months," she began. "We've brought in new chefs, introduced new dishes, and started to build a more inclusive and diverse environment here at the Gilded Plate. And I know that for some of you, these changes have been challenging, but this is the direction we're moving in, together." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "That being said, I've noticed some resistance to the changes. And while I understand that change can be difficult, I need to make one thing very clear. This new direction isn't optional. If you can't support what we're trying to build here, then you need to make a decision. Either you're with us, or you're not." The room was silent, but Jamal could see the tension on certain faces. He knew this wasn't going to go over smoothly with everyone, but it had to be done. After the meeting, a few staff members approached Laura privately, expressing their concerns. Some were genuine, asking for more time to adjust to the changes. Others, however, made it clear that they didn't agree with the new direction and would be leaving. It was a painful process, but one that ultimately made the restaurant stronger. Those who remained were fully committed to the vision, and the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift once again, this time for the better. A glimmer of hope. With the internal resistance quelled and the changes solidified, the Gilded Plate continued to thrive. The guest chef program expanded, bringing in talent from around the world, each new addition adding a unique flavor to the menu. Word spread that the restaurant was not just a place to eat, but a place to experience the future of food, where diversity and excellence went hand in hand. Jamal continued his work with Culinary Voices, using the platform to highlight the stories of the chefs who had contributed to the Gilded Plate's transformation. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about creating a space where everyone's stories could be told and celebrated. One evening, as Jamal and Maria sat down for dinner at the Gilded Plate, now bustling with a mix of old and new patrons, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but they had succeeded in creating something truly special. "We're just getting started," Maria said with a smile, raising her glass to Jamal. He clinked his glass against hers, his heart full. "Yeah," he agreed. "We are." Triumph and legacy. The air was electric that evening. The Gilded Plate was fully booked, with reservations stretching weeks into the future, a complete reversal of its earlier decline. The restaurant's reputation had transcended the city and attracted the attention of international food critics, influencers, and even a few celebrities who wanted to witness firsthand the cultural renaissance that had taken place within its walls. The challenges they had faced now seemed like distant memories, but their lessons were etched in every corner of the restaurant, in every dish that was served, and in every guest who walked through the door. A night of celebration. On this particular evening, the restaurant was hosting its first major event since the transformation, a global culinary gala celebrating the diversity that had saved the establishment and given it new life. Chefs from around the world, each of whom had contributed to the reimagining of the menu, were returning for a one-night-only collaboration. From the fiery spices of the Caribbean to the subtle, aromatic herbs of Southeast Asia, each dish was a celebration of global flavors, with the chefs presenting courses that reflected their own cultural heritage. Jamal Carter stood by the entrance, watching as guests filed in, each dressed in their finest, with excitement palpable in their faces. It had been months since he first walked through those very doors, met with cold rejection from a staff that saw him as nothing more than an outsider. The irony was not lost on him. Now, as the co-creator of the new vision for the restaurant, he was an integral part of its success. His anonymity was gone, but that was no longer the point. He wasn't just a critic or a writer. He was part of something far greater than himself. Maria, radiant in a flowing blue dress, stood beside him. She, too, had been a pivotal figure in the transformation of the Gilded Plate, and Jamal could see the pride in her eyes as she welcomed guests to their tables. Together, they had fought to change the culture of the restaurant, to make it a place where everyone, whether staff, patron, or chef, felt respected and valued. They had done it. "You're smiling," Maria teased, nudging him playfully. "That's rare. What's going through that busy mind of yours?" Jamal chuckled, "Just thinking about how far we've come. This place was on the brink of collapse, and now look at it. We did this." Maria smiled warmly. "We did. But don't get too comfortable. There's always more work to be done." Jamal nodded, knowing she was right. The fight against exclusion, racism, and cultural bias was far from over. But tonight, they would celebrate their victory, a victory that represented more than just financial success. It was a triumph over entrenched prejudice, over the gatekeeping that had long dominated the culinary world. The return of a ghost. As Jamal and Maria stood by the entrance, exchanging glances and pleasantries with the guests, a figure walked through the doors that caught both of them off guard. It was Mark. He looked different, wearing a simple suit instead of the polished uniform he had once worn as the restaurant's front-of-house manager. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the room before finally landing on Jamal and Maria. For a moment, it felt as though time stopped. The last time they had seen Mark was the day he had walked out after being forced to confront the changing dynamics of the restaurant, after his prejudices had been laid bare. Maria's smile faltered, but she quickly composed herself, her posture straightening as she turned to face him. "Mark," she said evenly, I didn't expect to see you here." Mark approached them slowly, looking almost sheepish. "I heard about the gala," he said, his voice low. "I wanted to see what's become of the place." Jamal crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "And what do you think?" Mark hesitated, his gaze flickering to the bustling dining room, where guests were being served dishes from all over the world, each plate a symbol of the Gilded Plate's new ethos. "It's different," he said finally. "I can see that a lot has changed." "More than you know," Maria replied, her tone sharp but controlled. Mark looked down, the weight of his past actions seeming to hang heavy over him. "I've had a lot of time to think," he said quietly, "about how I treated you, both of you. I was wrong." It was an apology, but not the kind that either Jamal or Maria had expected. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Jamal broke the silence. "You weren't just wrong about us, Mark," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You were wrong about this place, about what makes it special. It's not just a high-end restaurant for a certain type of people. It's a place where everyone should feel welcome, where everyone's story matters." Mark nodded, though he seemed unsure of how to respond. "I see that now," he admitted, "and I'm sorry for what I said. I was afraid of losing what I thought this place was supposed to be." Maria softened, her eyes searching his face. "It wasn't just fear, Mark. It was hate. And that's not something you can just apologize for and move on from." Mark's shoulders slumped slightly, and he nodded. "I know. I have a lot to make up for. I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted to at least say it." Jamal exchanged a glance with Maria. They both knew that this moment was about more than just Mark. It was about the countless people who had stood in the way of progress, clinging to old ideas about who belonged and who didn't. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. "You've said what you needed to say," Jamal replied after a pause. "Now it's up to you to prove you've changed." Mark nodded again, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of diners. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start, a lasting legacy. As the evening continued, the atmosphere in the restaurant grew more lively, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation filling the air. The global culinary gala was a resounding success, with each dish receiving applause and praise from the guests. But more than the food, it was the spirit of the event, the celebration of cultures, of diversity, of unity, that left a lasting impression on everyone in attendance. At the end of the night, after the last guest had left and the kitchen was winding down, Jamal, Maria, and Laura gathered in the now quiet dining room. They were exhausted but exhilarated. The event had been everything they had hoped for and more. Laura raised a glass of champagne, her eyes shining with emotion. "To the Gilded Plate," she said, her voice thick with pride. "To everything we've built together." "To the future," Maria added, clinking her glass against Laura's. Jamal raised his own glass, his heart full as he looked at the two women who had become his partners in this journey. "To breaking down barriers," he said softly. "To changing the game." They drank, the taste of success sweeter than anything they had ever experienced. But it wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about what the Gilded Plate had come to represent. It was proof that change was possible, even in an industry as entrenched in tradition and exclusion as the culinary world. It was a testament to the power of diversity, of inclusion, and of resilience. As they sat in the quiet dining room, the memories of the journey they had taken together played out in their minds. The struggles, the victories, the setbacks, and the triumphs. And though they knew that there would always be more work to do, more battles to fight, they also knew that they had already made a difference. The Gilded Plate had become more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of what could happen when people came together, embraced each other's differences, and refused to let the world tell them who they could or couldn't be. And as Jamal looked around the room, at the tables where people from all walks of life had come to share a meal and a story, he knew that this was just the beginning. The legacy they were building would endure, far beyond the walls of the Gilded Plate, and far beyond anything they could have imagined. The aftertaste of victory. As they left the restaurant that night, the stars shining brightly above them, Jamal felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight for change was never easy, and the road had been fraught with challenges. But they had shown the world that food was not just sustenance. It was culture, history, and identity. And in the end, that was the most powerful thing of all. As they locked the doors behind them, leaving the Gilded Plate to rest for the night, Jamal smiled to himself. The world was changing, and they were a part of it. The taste of victory lingered, not just on his tongue, but in his heart. And with that, the night came to a close. But the story was far from over.